their loss, talking with John earlier, so you're going to give them a one-time payment of all they would be owed over potentially many years, depending on their capacity. You're not going to.
No, it's right. We calculated. We made a calculation that looked at what would we pay them to help them reasonably manage their way through the loss of the revenue. But we're going to make a one-time payment. As it says on the top of this spreadsheet, it explains what the law is going to say, which you'll see on Wednesday, where we're going to make them create a fund. We're going to deposit that money into the fund. They're going to have to pass a resolution to take the money out of that fund and put it to their general fund or wherever wherever their sales tax revenues go, and they can decide when they want to do it and how much they want to move. Again, if you're a county that is heavily hit, prudently you might want to use that money and slowly withdraw it and deposit it into your general fund or elsewhere over time to help you manage the impact. But that'll be up to them. It's a one-time payment, probably in October.
Is that to avoid the phenomenon that you went through with the TPP, where it was supposed to phase out, and every 2 years you had the debate about, well, we can't really keep going with this because we'll.
Could be. That might have been part of our consideration.
What do you say? What do you say to those? Like Franklin County, I think is going to lose would be about $12 million less. What do you say to those counties who are obviously not going to be pleased that they are going to ultimately be collecting less money starting next calendar year?
I would say that they've only been collecting it since 2010. And I don't know why we would permanently replace a temporary revenue source that they benefited from over the last 6 years.
Couldn't they argue that they've already built this into their budgets now over those 6 years because it wasn't anticipated to be one-time funding or a funding stream that was going to come to an end?
Well, and now they'll have to manage their way off. And we've given them a tool to thoughtfully manage their way through this change in law. Laws are changed periodically that affects revenue sources.
We haven't kept this quiet either, have we?
No, I mean, we've been talking about this since the spring. I mean, we started talking to the members of the General Assembly in the spring. I met with the county commissioners in late June. I met with the county auditors. I met with the county treasurers. I met with the Transit Authority and talked to them about, this was coming. We were working on it. That it likely was going to be, we were likely going to have a transition solution, but that we would have a solution because we acknowledged, particularly for some jurisdictions, this an immediate loss was just going to be too much for them to manage. And so we have come up with what we think is a thoughtful transitional payment mechanism to help them adjust to the change in the tax base.
Can you explain this on that aid? Can you explain this ratio of total transitional aid to average sales tax revenue? It looks like maybe 25% is kind of the floor, but there's really no ceiling on it.
I mean, this is just illustrative. What this column basically tells you is, the higher the number, basically it means that this was an entity that was way more dependent on the tax, and they have a lower sales tax base. It means they have a lower capacity, in our view, to manage their way to absorb the loss of the revenue. And so at the top, Adams is a great example, right? You go to the third to last column. 16% of Adams County's piggyback sales tax came from the managed care sales tax base, and their sales tax per capita sales tax capacity is like 57% of the statewide average, meaning that they are not going to see don't have a strong base to rely on. And so essentially then they get higher payments. And so they're gonna get 3.38 times annual. You know, you go to like Delaware County, who I know had a very, very low reliance, right? I mean, they had 1.68% of their sales tax came from this, and then look at their sales tax base, 167%. So they're in pretty good shape. So they get a relatively small, and again, 0.25, essentially, there are 8 counties that are gonna get 0.25 because those are the counties whose reliance was so low and their tax bases are high enough that we paid them because this payment consists of 2 components. It's everybody gets a calculated replacement payment for the final quarter of 17, and then other counties, not those 8 that I just referenced, they get the formula amount to make additional payments above and beyond that.
I'm trying to be sure, the final calculation on the Formula 8 amount, does that end up being a percentage of their current total allocation once you compute the whole formula? Or how did you, like, for example, Adams County, how did you ultimately arrive at a $2.16 million number? I mean, I get the formula, but how did it, what did it ultimately get based on?
This will walk you all the way through it, but essentially what we did is we said, I mean, there's, at the far right column, we've assigned, the far column is assigned annual incremental absorption rate, right? Which basically was, if you have sales tax capacity above or beyond the state average, we basically thought that you could absorb up to you could absorb 4 percentage points a year. Adams, we basically assigned them 2.28 because they're lesser, they're below. So essentially you take that 2.28, we say in any given year they can't absorb more than 2.28 of that 16.51 number that's 2 columns over. And so we basically rerun. So in the first year, we felt they could absorb 2.28% of 16. We pay them everything above that. Then we just repeat the process.
So basically, the closer the last column and the third of the last column are to each other, the less money they're going to get. Or they'll get 0 money if the last column is more. Then, like in Delaware, it's 4 versus 1.68. If it's more, you're getting 0. Because you can,
in the subsequent years, that's right. So basically, that's right. If your reliance was below 4%, right, in the first year, you don't get the formula aid. All you do is get the first calculated aid. That's essentially what it says. And this thing, if you read through this thing, the description of the steps used, you'll be able to you'll get a better sense of it.
Did you get to look at the LSC's, the revenue estimates? Was that apples to apples?
You know, I have not had a chance to study it yet,
As they
Ken.
said, because they said that basically you left in these payments even though they're not going to be there as your baseline.
Well, because, yes, we did.
And you had like adjustments to your baseline.
Well,
in
we
your
did.
testimony as well, so.
We did. We left them in because, again, strictly speaking, it is. I mean, look, that was a methodological determination. So I presume they knew what we did, so they did the same thing. So presumably they are apples to apples. I have not looked at that to know definitively that they are, but my sense is they probably are. I mean, we made a further, for the purposes of my testimony, I talked about the fact that those baseline numbers with Medicaid managed care sales tax in are artificially inflated because we're going to have more people on managed care, and so the receipts would have kept going up. So you have to adjust that out to know what's happening with the rest of the sales tax base, which is why I, in my testimony, referred to that additional adjustment necessary to know what the growth rate of the rest of the economy would be, based on the growth rate of the economy projecting, what the growth rate for the rest of the sales tax base would be. And it's well lower than the actual baseline number that we had showed there. Because there was going to be growth out of this as managed care numbers, and cost of managed care ramps up. But I think, that's a long way to say I think that they are comparable.
Is your capacity-based LGF thing, is that reflected for libraries too?
No, no,
Okay.
because they don't get touched by the LGF. The LGF, it just is, it's cities, counties, townships, and villages. And again, the capacity-based LGF, I mean, the idea of doing that grew somewhat out of the work we did on this managed care sales tax replacement, because it makes it real clear the range of capacity that exists across the state for the counties in the sales tax. I mean, look at the wide range of per capita sales tax base across the state. You know, 167 in Delaware. I think that's the highest. And look, we had identified Adams at 56. There might be somebody lower than that. Let's find Vinton.
Benton.
Yeah, 36, yeah. So that's a tremendously wide range, tremendously wide range. And so it just struck us, in particular if you understand the way the local government fund is actually distributed now, which is essentially based on property valuation in municipal corporations. I mean, that is the key driver of of deciding how much goes to each county. And so that dramatically favors counties with lots of property value. And who has lots of property value? The counties that are generally wealthier. And so that means we are taking state tax dollars and we are distributing it to the wealthy through the local government fund. Does that make sense? Now, it might have made sense in 1935 when they put this thing in place to address revenue losses that these entities were getting, because remember, they only had property tax. Revenue losses that the Great Depression was causing because property values were going down and or people couldn't pay their property tax bills. But 80 years later, it doesn't make sense for us to do that. So we're just suggesting a very small portion of the local government fund be distributed on a capacity basis.
How much of that is in the first year?
The first year we would, and so the first year we think 10% of the LGF would go out this way. And we think it would be 18% the second year, and then we proposed that it be 20, which we think would be reached in 2020. The local government fund, you know, we didn't touch the total amount. I mean, it's 166% of GRF tax receipts as under current law. And we expect that will grow modestly in each of the next 2 years. You know, just on the library fund, just a word on the library fund. I mean, we are using the permanent law 1.66% of the library, of GRF revenues for the library fund as well. Now, if you look in the budget bill, there's a slight decline in what goes to the libraries. That's because the General Assembly put in a temporary law provision that gave them 1.7% in this last 2-year period of time. So they had a temporary law provision which has expired. We maintained the current law.
Why not maintain it at 1.7, considering what the governor said in his budget about wanting to make libraries, I forget what he calls centralized learning centers. He really seemed to put a focus on libraries.
Mm-hmm.
Then you look at the budget and libraries are actually cut.
Well, they're going to get their current law distributions.
Well,
They're going to get their
cut funds.
They're getting their current law distributions. The General Assembly made a choice to temporarily increase them for 2 years. The rebranding effort as continuous learning centers does not require a significant influx of resources.
Does it send a mixed message, though?
I don't think so.
On the subject of mixed messages, you had said in your testimony a couple days ago that we've had slower wage and salary income growth than in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
But on the governor's introduction to the budget on his website, he says Ohioans' wages have grown faster than the national average. And he said that at the AP forum a couple days ago. Which one's correct?
That's some information. I
Yeah,
can
both,
share.
both, as a matter of fact.
Both are correct, because there's different ways to look at that wage growth, different formulas, different people do it different ways. I can send you some information on the 4 different ways that it is calculated.
Is that misleading, though, for the governor to be saying that they're growing faster than average, and you saying in your testimony that they're growing slower than average?
I don't think so.
Why not? I mean, they sound like two different statements.
Both statements are accurate. Both statements are accurate. Again, and from, I just leave it at that. Both statements are accurate.
Tim, can you speak to the decision on flat funding for early childhood education and, I believe, infant mortality funds?
Infant mortality funds. I mean, I feel like there's an increase in infant mortality in the health department. There's an increase in resources that are going for that. You know, with regard to early childhood education, it's my understanding the system is still absorbing the substantial increases that we put in place 2 years ago. And in a difficult budget, difficult choices are required. I mean, in the education budget, we tried to prioritize the foundation formula and put as much money as we could into the foundation formula. And so there were other things that we could not do.
A question about the school choice program series and the education
Mhm.
budget. There's some like sizable reduction in foundation funding, but then there's an addition of this line for charter schools, and like, are you just moving money around in there? Or is there any kind of overall reduction increase? I'm kind of wondering also if any of this reflects the fact that like we have fewer charter schools and fewer charter school students for the first time in forever.
Yeah, I would have to, I'd have to look at it and get back to you.
Okay.
I can't immediately
And
answer that
also,
question.
this Department of Education is sort of proceeding under the idea that there are several thousand fewer e-school students and stuff like that. I don't know if any of that shows up.